Hello everyone, in my presentation today, I will be talking about populism. By using the book Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism, written by Engelhardt and Norris, published in 2019. I will be discussing about how we can conceptualize populism and how we can analyze the rhetoric behind populist leaders. I hope after listening to my presentation, you'll have a better understanding of what populism actually is. The topic of this presentation is derived from Advanced Seminar 4, organized by Professor Willie Zhou. My presentation today is divided into two parts. First, I will be defining populism and authoritarian populism. In the second part, I will be conceptualizing populism and the rhetoric used by populist leaders, with a focus on the campaign strategies employed by those populist leaders. And all the contents and information that I will be referring to in my presentation are from the book of Engelhardt and Norris. Okay, so let us move on to define populism and authoritarian populism. Although many different researchers and scholars have provided different definitions and conceptualizations of populism, Engelhardt and Norris suggest that it is a good idea to define populism in a minimalist approach. From this minimalist perspective, populism is defined as a form of discourse about the first-order principles of governance, delegitimizing established power structures and the role of elected representative in liberal democracy, while claiming that the people should rule. And populism reflects a powerful appeal in an era of cynicism. And it is silent about second-order ideological values about what governments should do. In many cases, it fails to provide some substantial suggestions about policy proposals. By understanding this point, we can unpack the notion of populism. The opposite of populism is pluralism. It is to understand that legitimate authority is to rest with elected representatives and the liberal democratic institutions, providing checks and balances on executive power. And it emphasizes on the separation of powers between the three branches. The chart on the right-hand side of the slide shows two pairs of cleavages. When we talk about the multidimensional party competition, we're talking about some main cleavages. Some of them include populist, pluralist divisions in orientations toward the legitimate source of governance, the left and right divisions over economic values, as well as the authoritarian and libertarian on cultural values. Even though libertarian populism also exists, most of the academic discussions are focused on authoritarian populism. And as we know, many of the media coverage focus on authoritarian populism as well. Engelhardt and Norris argues that the combination of authoritarianism and populism poses the most serious risk for liberal democracy. They argue that they corrode trust in the established mechanisms which safeguard democratic checks and balances, which include the protection of minority rights, the role of the free press, judicial independence, and plural debate in civil society. This allows strongman leaders claiming to speak for the people to step into the power vacuum, while simultaneously endorsing social intolerance toward outgroups, for example, immigrants, foreigners, minority groups, depending on where they direct their anger given the social environment. After clarifying the definition of populism, let us move on to talk about the strategies of populist leaders. Without endorsing a specific orientation of a public policy, populism can be seen as a rhetorical style of communication, claiming that the only legitimate democratic authority flows directly from the people, and the established power holders are deeply corrupt and self-interested, self-serving, betraying public trust, and should be thrown out. Engelhardt and Norris argued that populist narratives can be minimally reduced to only these two twin components. Next, let us talk about the populist appeal based on these two components. First, the anti-establishment appeal lies in its claim that legitimate democratic authority is sought to be derived from unconstrained majority rule, and hardline and decisive strongman leaders should be in power. And second, the voice of the people should outweigh all institutions and safeguards designed to protect minority rights. Here I list some of the most important populist assertions and claims. The true or genuine democracy is by ordinary people, which the populists call the silent majority, which emphasize their authentic grassroots credentials. Legitimacy from direct popular expression reflects the voice of the people, where majority preferences override minority interests. And Inglehart and Norris show statistically that the populists try to cater to the less educated and those in rural areas. The populist leaders try to claim that the authority of the voice of the people is valued even when at odds with professional specialists. Legal authorities and government officials, mainstream media and press commentators, scientific experts, and elected politicians. Some of the common expressions used by populists include Britain has had enough of experts. They are fake news. Climate change and COVID-19 is a hoax. And they are just out for themselves, the politicians. And sometimes they also attack on big corporations and banks. For example, calling them to be stealing all the money from the people, and call them reckless Wall Street bankers and speculators. They try to portray the wealthy and the privileged bankers and politicians as elites. And they try to appeal to people who have lost hope and confidence in the existing system, therefore hope for future leaders to come into power and bring change. The resentment and blame of populism are directed both upward toward the so-called deeply morally corrupt political leaders, commercial elites, and intellectuals, as well as downward toward immigrants, foreigners, minority groups, and see them as scapegoats. Here, I will talk about some of the populist communication channels. The populist leaders, they seek collective actions, so they use plebiscites, referenda, demonstrations, mass rallies, and opinion polls. And also they tend to like television talk shows and modern social media such as Twitter, which are powerful communication tools with the ordinary people. They want to mobilize support by providing a direct and unfiltered communication link between the leaders and the followers by passing scrutiny by journalists. As for the populist language, they use characteristically simple, repetitive, and emotionally powerful words. And they also use derogatory insults toward components, vulgar language, and racial slurs toward minorities. And they try to reinforce themselves to articulate the authentic voice, virtue, and experience of ordinary people. This style allows leaders to appeal to diverse groups with heterogeneous grievances, to communicate messages to unsophisticated publics, and if elected to office, to minimize being held accountable in delivering specific policies. And what seems counterintuitive is that political inexperience here is regarded as a badge of honor by outsiders. And here, political inexperience is not seen as a disqualification, but being untainted by elected office. When the populist leaders want to pose challenges to the established power structure, they seek to use the anti-establishment populist rhetoric. They want to pose challenges to the power in liberal democracies, for example, the elites holding political, cultural, and economic power. They seek a radical revolution to restore real democracy by the real people, as what they call it. And they try to draw a line between us and them. Us means the ordinary people, them meaning the elites. In their imagined storyline, the leader becomes the paternalistic leader who can say something like, I alone can fix it. They portray the elites as symbolic villains and the ordinary people as heroes who are hardworking and righteous. Here, let me give you an example of Donald Trump's campaign speech. In his own storyline, he ran as an authentic outsider to Broadway politics, a self-made billionaire leading an insurgency movement on behalf of forgotten Americans, disgusted with incompetent politicians, dishonest lobbyists, reckless Wall Street speculators, fake media, incompetent bureaucrats, arrogant intellectuals, and so on. He sees the foreign powers as exploiting America, and that the politically correct liberals are destroying American society. And he often used some of the classroom bully nicknames, such as Sleepy Joe and Crook Hillary, as we sometimes see in secondary or high schools. An important part of the populist speech characteristic is that it rejects the legitimacy of authority derived from scientific evidence, book learning, and reasoned deliberation. Instead, the discourse celebrates the authenticity of direct experience, mass opinions representation, and quick applause lines. which reflects the style of talk shows, tabloid headlines, social media networks, and the everyday language of people. Therefore, the populists share a common conviction about what they are against, depicting themselves as outsiders rooted in the wisdom of ordinary folks and as insurgents, fighting the powerful establishment, rather than providing some concrete or detailed policy suggestions. Some common phrases include, "Believe me," "Many people say," "I alone can fix it." Now let me give you a summary from my presentation today. The core characteristic of populism is that it calls for political reform and radical change, but does not suggest coherent and something concrete blueprint for what policies the people's revolution should advance, such as the appropriate way to steer the economy or to conduct foreign affairs and diplomacy. It is a political ideology of governance, which is about legitimate authority, but not substantive policy program orientations. It is more a communication style rather than specific policy. Due to the vagueness of the policy proposals they provide, many hyphenated varieties of populism they exist. The populist leaders therefore diverge sharply in terms of their worldviews and advocacy of policy programs. To conclude, although some of the summary points can be made about how populist leaders and parties mobilize support, however, populist parties and leaders are not identical across countries or over time. They change and they have differences. And some populist parties may have libertarian characteristics and elements incorporated. Although most research are focused on authoritarian populism, there is still some discussions about libertarian populism. However, because of the time constraint today, I will not be talking about them.